All right, so earlier this month, I read Perdido Street Station by China Miéville, and while I will most likely share my thoughts on this book with you in another video, what I will say is that while reading this book, I was genuinely reminded of how enjoyable it can be to read a standalone fantasy book and just experience a story for what it is from beginning to end and then move on to something else. This led me to think of a number of standalone fantasy books that I haven't yet gotten to, but would love to read and would love to start incorporating in my read through of these longer epic series and duologies and trilogies. So today, I'm going to be sharing with you 10 standalone fantasy books that I want to read. Hello everyone, welcome back to Tall Guy Reads. My name is Alex, and yes, today we're going to be talking about 10 standalone fantasy books that I haven't yet read but would love to get to and would love to start prioritizing in my read through of these longer epic series and trilogies and duologies. Three main rules. The first one is that this list is entirely fantasy. There are a number of science fiction and horror standalones that I want to get to that I haven't yet read, but that is for another discussion and another topic at a later time. So for this list specifically, every book on this list is 100% fantasy. Secondly, I try to stay away from any standalone fantasy books that are intertwined in a larger universe or series or whose events could impact books that come on later in the series. For example, there will be no First Law or Cosmere standalones in this list. And third, there will be no duplicate authors. So I didn't just take a number of Guy Gavriel Kay books and put them in this list. And while I want to read a lot of Guy Gavriel Kay and a number of other authors on this list that have multiple fantasy standalones, I went with the book by each author that I am most excited and most anticipating when I get the chance to read them. So with all of that said and all of that out of the way, let's dive into the list. All right, so the first book on this list is one that is probably one of the most talked about standalone fantasy books on booktube for the many months and probably the last year or so, and that is Tagana by Guy Gavriel Kay. This book sounds absolutely fascinating to me, and yet at the same time, I don't really know a lot of what it's about. I do know that it is set in a world that is inspired by Renaissance Italy, and it talks about what would happen if an entire memory of a people or a country or a city is removed. When a dark sorcerer curses land to destroy Tagana and basically any memory or record of it, a group of people fight back, and that's pretty much the setup that I understand of the story, and it sounds very interesting, and I love stories about memory and just the loss of people's recollection of a certain event or place or person. So outside of that, I don't know a whole lot about this book. I do know that this book is very divisive though, and I know some people absolutely love Tagana and say this is the absolute best place to start with Guy Gavriel Kay. This is one of the best fantasy standalones ever written, and they just love everything about this book. And there are a number of people that don't agree with that at all and say this lags significantly in the middle, and this is just not one of the most impressive standalone fantasy books from Guy Gavriel Kay and just in fantasy in general. But what I do know and what I have heard on a general consensus from people who have read the book is that while it definitely slows down in the middle, it all comes together at the end very well and provides a very satisfying ending to this overall standalone fantasy epic. And I have wanted to read this for years, and I think I do want to read The Lions of Alverson too. That's probably my second most anticipated Guy Gavriel Kay book that I want to get to. But this book, especially Tagana, is the one that I most likely 99.9% chance will start with when I get the chance to incorporate a standalone fantasy book in my read through, especially for my first Guy Gavriel Kay novel, and I'm very excited for it. Another extremely popular fantasy series that has been making its rounds on booktube for months and years is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And while that is absolutely a book that I would love to get to and I would love to read and I haven't yet read, that's actually not the one by Susanna Clarke that I'm going to put on this list. The second book on this list is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is basically a book about, a world where magic has been gone for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, a magician starts wandering the streets and, there might be a glimmer of some magic. It sounds like it combines the writing style of authors like Dickens and Austen with the intrigue of a book like The Prestige by Christopher Priest, which is also a movie by Christopher Nolan that I absolutely recommend if you haven't seen it. It's one of my favorite movies. But getting back to the topic, the premise of this book just sounds fascinating. And I love that it takes place in England, and it's in England that has been without magic for years. And all of a sudden, maybe it's back. And I'm very intrigued to check out the story. It's one of those books that I've seen at bookstores and used bookstores for years, and I've always been intrigued by the cover. I know there was a TV adaptation of some sort made. I never saw it, but this is absolutely a book that I want to get to, and is one that I want to prioritize soon, because even though this is long, from what I've heard, it's just a fantastic read from beginning to end. So I absolutely would love to read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. The third book on this list is by an author that I have talked about on this channel before, and that is Clive Barker. And this is a dark fantasy novel, and this is one of his most popular novels that he's ever written, and that is, of course, Weave World. So I know the basic premise of Weave World is about a world, a magical world that is hidden inside a tapestry, and there are two people that are set to kind of save it from being destroyed by opposing foes and opposing enemies. And that sounds like a very basic premise, but, Clive Barker has a way of just taking the very basic idea and turning into something that is incredibly unique, incredibly extravagant, and is just something like that is different than any other author. And I'm just very much looking forward to checking out Weave World. I think this and Imagica are my most anticipated reads by Clive Barker, but I would say Weave World especially. This is the one that I am very much looking forward to getting to, and I will be trying to get to soon, because, I love almost everything I've read by Clive Barker so far, and I can't wait to read, some of his most popular books that he's ever written. Okay, so moving on from Weave World, the next book on this list is also another dark fantasy novel, and that is The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. And this is a book that's talked about from time to time on booktube, but overall not that much. However, the people that have read it have said either they love it, or at least it's just incredibly compelling, and it's one that makes them think. And, they close the last page of this book and they still find themselves really thinking about everything that happened in this book. What I know is that it revolves around a person named Carolyn, who is taken in by a godlike figure known as the Father when she was young, along with a number of other kids. And the Father teaches her and her step siblings, or her adopted siblings, some of his ancient customs. And after his death, there's a battle of custody or of control over the Father's secrets. And that's pretty much all I know. I know this is extremely weird. I know there's a lot of weirdness that happens in this book, and it's just kind of out there, but I've also heard that, some people that have read this book have said this is just one of their favorite books they've ever read, and is one of the most unique and also at the same time compelling books that they have ever read in the fantasy genre and beyond. So I've been wanting to read this for a while, but recently I've been getting the itch to finally pick up The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. So for the fifth book on this list, we're moving on to epic fantasy. And there's a read-along going on right now with some awesome channels like Jimmy from the Fantasy Network, Philip Chase, AP Canavan, Joanna. I think they're all doing Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wirtz. And Janny Wirtz is an author that I haven't read but would love to get to. And I've mentioned her in my classic fantasy video when I was talking about her Daughter of an Empire trilogy, the Empire trilogy that she did with Raymond E. Feist. And I don't have time right now to fit in Wars of Light and Shadow, and I think that's going to be something I'm going to try to get to in 2023, or, the back half of 2023 or something like that. But in the meantime, I do want to read To Ride Hell's Chasm, and this is a standalone epic fantasy book by Janny Wirtz. I don't know a lot about this book, but I do know it revolves around a princess that goes missing, and two people are kind of sent to find her, and they're sent after her. And in the process, they discover there might have been some alternative reason for her disappearance that's not just her being kidnapped or what they initially thought was going to happen. And this just sounds very interesting. I love epic fantasy. It's probably my favorite. If I was going to call epic fantasy a subgenre of fantasy, it's my favorite subgenre. I love a very well thought out, well built world with long drawn out character arcs and just a very satisfying ending. And I've heard this is a great epic fantasy standalone, and I'm really excited to check it out. And it'll just give me a chance to get a taste of Janny Wirtz's writing style and the writing, and find out if this is an author that I really click with. And I hope it is, because the premises of her other books sound incredibly fascinating, and I really hope I enjoy this, and then that will only encourage me more and invigorate me more to check out the Wars of Light and Shadow and the Empire trilogy that she did with Raymond E. Feist. Another one of my favorite types of stories are mythology retelling. So Greek, Roman, Egyptian, anything like that I find to be usually very fascinating and very interesting, especially when it's done very well. And there have been two that have absolutely taken the fantasy and the fiction world by storm over the last couple of years, and both have been by Madeline Miller. The first one being The Song of Achilles, and the second one being Circe. And Circe is the one that I think a lot of people would recommend starting off with. They say that's her stronger book. And, looking at the premise of both of these, the one that really grabs my attention is the one that I will almost definitely choose first, is the Song of Achilles. This is the one that definitely stands out to me and is the one that I cannot wait to finally get to. So from what I know about the story, it is told from the viewpoint of a young prince who is banished from his father and forced to live in the court of Peleus, where he meets Achilles. And I have wanted to read this for so long. I think I bought this copy the second it was out on paperback years ago, and I don't know why I haven't gotten to this. I haven't even read Circe, and I'm just so interested in these two books, and especially this one, though. I've always been fascinated by Achilles and just, Troy and everything related to this time period in history and mythology. And I'm just very excited to read Madeline Miller's work finally, and especially read the Song of Achilles. So the seventh book on this list is Kindred by Octavia Butler. And Octavia Butler is an absolute titan of the fantasy and science fiction genre. She is a writer that I've wanted to read for a long time, and I just haven't had the chance to do so. But Kindred is probably the book that I want to pick up first. It's one of her most beloved books and revolves around a young African-American woman living in LA in the 70s who gets transported back in time to pre-Civil War Maryland, where she reconnects with her ancestors, and she's forced to try to fight for her survival in slavery and try to escape and return back to her own time. And as someone who is extremely passionate for civil and human rights, and who grew up and spent all of my life in Maryland for the most part until college, I have wanted to read this book for a long time, and I think that I will really enjoy this book, and this will be a very compelling read for me. So I'm very excited to read Kindred, and I will be trying to get to it as soon as possible. But I can't wait to read this book, and I'm very much looking forward to get to it. All right, so moving on to my eighth book. I don't think you could have gone on BookTube in the years of 2019 to 2021 and listened to a video about standalones without hearing this book. And that is, of course, The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong. So as I understand it, The Sword of Kaigan was originally written as a book one for a trilogy or a duology or a series. And as it stands right now, is a standalone. So that's why I'm putting it on this list, because a lot of people who have read this book have said this is one of their favorite standalone fantasy books they've ever read. It was probably a lot of people's favorite books that they read in the year that they read it, and I've heard nothing but amazing things about this book. So from what I know about the Sword of Kaigan, it revolves around a character named Mamoru and his mother Misaki. And Mamoru has been taught all his life that his purpose in life is to defend his homeland, and he believes it. However, after he starts to learn more about the reality of things, he starts to understand that, hey, maybe everything that he's known all his life has been built on a foundation of lies and propaganda. And this obviously leads to some inner turmoil and some conflict between him and his identity and his place in the greater world. I have heard nothing but almost universal praise about this book, and I am so excited to give it a shot, because I've had it on my Kindle for months and I haven't had the chance to read it, but I can't wait to do so. And this is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong, and I'm so excited to read this book. So the ninth book on this list is one that is written by an author that I've talked about on this channel, but I haven't read anything by, and that is Adrian Tchaikovsky, and the book is Guns of the Dawn. So first, Adrian Tchaikovsky is one of the most prolific fantasy and science fiction writers that I can think of. He has written so much and such a wide variety of different things. Guns of the Dawn is his Flintlock fantasy standalone, and Flintlock fantasy is a combination of fantasy and magic with colonial weapons and early gunpowder weapons. And this just sounds like an absolutely amazing combination and combines two things that I love. And I'm so excited to read and experience a Flintlock fantasy book, and I've heard nothing but amazing things about Guns of the Dawn. I know it revolves around a young female protagonist who is fighting to defend her country in a war, and as soon becomes conflicted over the country's cause, and this leads to some inner turmoil and kind of, this battle to determine what her place is in this world and in this war, and just what she must do in order to make herself feel fulfilled and so on. And that's about all I know about this story, but it sounds incredibly interesting. And from what I've heard from a number of booktubers who have read this recently, like Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads, Joanna, Alan from the Library of Alexandria, and Sarah from Sarah Reads, they've loved this book. I think everyone who has read this book in the last couple of months have absolutely loved this, and this has been one of their favorite standalones that they've ever read. So I am incredibly excited to check this book out, and I can't wait to do so. And that is Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, for the final book on this list, this is an author that I would not have heard of if it wasn't for Alan from the Library of Alexandria. So I thank him for this, for leading me on to this author, because some of his stuff sounds incredibly interesting. But this is the one that I want to pick up first, because honestly, just from the basic premise, this sounds like it's right up my alley. and that is The Folding Knife by K.J. Parker. So from what I understand, the basic premise of The Folding Knife is about the rise and fall of a man who goes from being one of the most wealthy and powerful men in the country to making one mistake and an undoing a lifetime of achievement. And this sounds so incredibly interesting, and I love complex character studies. And I've heard that this book has so much political intrigue and so much complex character development, and those are two things that I absolutely eat up. I love when those two things are done incredibly well, and this, as a standalone fantasy book that has those as like their two biggest highlights, sells this book for me right out of the gate. I'm so excited to give this book a shot and finally check out some KJ Parker, because there's a number of books that he's written that sound very interesting to me. I know 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City is one. The Company is another one that I want to read, but The Folding Knife is the first one that I want to get to, and I'm so excited to finally get to this because I've been wanting to read this for a few months, ever since I heard Alan over at the Library of Alexandria talk about this book. So overall, that is my list of 10 standalone fantasy books that I am just so excited to get to. Honestly, I'm not sure what book I'm going to pick up first on this list or in what order I'm going to read these or anything like that. But to be honest, every single book on this list sounds so incredibly interesting and fascinating to me, and I just can't wait to start incorporating some of these into my reading of these longer epic fantasy series and trilogies and duologies. But with all of that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this list. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please think about subscribing, hitting that bell notification down below. If you want to get updates of new videos as they come out, hit that like button. It helps me out and it helps the channel out a lot, and I really appreciate it. But with all of that said, I hope you guys have a fantastic day.